The official record of humanity's entrance onto the galactic stage was a masterpiece of cosmic pity. A single, battered generation ship limping out of the void, its occupants pale and physically unimpressive, hailing the first Galactic Consortium patrol they met with a plea for sanctuary. They were designated Species 734, Homeworld, Terra, a Class 4 death world, certainly respectable but nothing the galaxy hadn't seen before. Their technology was functional but archaic. Their physiology fragile. They lacked the granite-like hide of the Cathar, the innate psychic abilities of the Luminians, and the multi-spectrum vision of the Vex. They were soft, vulnerable, a species seemingly designed by evolution to be a footnote, a minor entry in the grand, brutal encyclopedia of the cosmos. And the Consortium, in its paternalistic wisdom, granted them a protectorate status. They were given a small sector of space, a few barely habitable worlds, and a list of rules long enough to choke a void Leviathan. They were the galaxy's charity case. The consensus among the elder races was clear. Humanity was a species that had miraculously survived its own planetary cradle, only to find itself hopelessly outmatched by the universe. They were deemed too weak for military service, too simple for high-level governance, and too fragile for the rigors of true deep space colonization. Their greatest perceived strength was their prolific nature, a trait many saw as a desperate biological hedge against their own inherent weakness. For 100 standard cycles, this perception held. Humans were laborers, low-level technicians, and diplomats in postings no one else wanted. They were polite, industrious, and utterly unremarkable. When the Galactic Unity Academy, the most prestigious institution of learning in the known galaxy, announced it was accepting its first-ever human transfer student as a gesture of inclusivity, the decision was met with a collective, patronizing sigh. It was a political move, a hollow token to prove the Consortium's benevolence. The headmaster of the academy, a Xylosian scholar named Ayler, reviewed the human's file with a weary sense of obligation. Name, Kalen, physical metrics, underwhelming. Aptitude scores, average. The only notable entry was a single line from the Human Diplomatic Corps. Subject Kalen represents the standard median for a healthy, young human adult. We believe he will provide an adequate baseline for your studies. Adequate. The word hung in Ayler's mind like a bad smell. His academy didn't deal in adequate. It forged leaders. It trained the best and brightest of 1,000 worlds to become the future of the galaxy. But the real debate, the one held in hushed tones in the high chambers of the Consortium Security Council, was about humanity's history. Or rather, the lack of it. Their records prior to their generation ship were a mess of fragmented data and mythological allegory. They spoke of endless, savage conflicts, world wars, atomic fire, genetic plagues, a relentless, self-destructive cycle of violence that had supposedly kept them trapped on their homeworld for millennia. The analysts who studied this history all reached the same conclusion. They presented their findings to the Council, a stark and unambiguous warning. No species could survive that many wars. It was a statistical and biological impossibility. The constant genetic bottlenecks, the planetary destruction, the psychological trauma, it would have sterilized them or driven them to madness and extinction long ago. Therefore, the human historical records had to be exaggerated, mythological. The primitive boasting of a young race trying to make itself seem more significant than it was. They had probably had a few minor tribal squabbles, amplified by cultural ego into an epic of struggle. This fatal assumption, this colossal misinterpretation, would become the single greatest mistake in the history of the Galactic Consortium. It was a mistake that began to unravel the day they decided to check the transfer students' medical records. Kalen's arrival at the academy was exactly as expected. He was of average height for his species, which made him noticeably smaller than most other students. He blinked in the binary sunlight of the Academy's central promenade, his simple optical senses overwhelmed. A group of young Cathar cadets, their stony skin glistening, shoved past him without a word, their sheer mass nearly sending him sprawling. He caught his balance with a quiet grunt, his face a mask of placid observation. He didn't complain, he didn't posture, he simply endured. This became his defining characteristic. In the telepathic debate halls, where Luminians wove complex arguments of pure thought, Kalen would sit in silence, his mind a quiet, unreadable fortress. When other students mocked his blank consciousness, he would just nod politely. In the zero-G combat arenas, where Vex warriors danced with six-limbed grace, Kalen was clumsy and slow, relying on thruster pack assistance that others used with contemptuous ease. He was consistently ranked last in his cohort. He became a running joke, the Terran charity, a living symbol of how benevolent the great races were to even allow such a creature to walk their hallowed halls. The primary combat instructor, a grizzled Cathar veteran named Vorlag, took a particular disliking to the human. Vorlag was a product of a warrior culture that worshipped strength and despised weakness. To him, Kalen wasn't just a student, he was an insult to the very concept of a warrior. The Terran's weakness is a contagion, Vorlag would bellow to his classes. It is a testament to the consortium's softness. They claim survival on a death world made them resilient. I see no evidence. I see a scavenger, a creature that survived by hiding in the cracks, not by facing the storm. To prove his point, Vorlag scheduled a special, hazard simulation. The exercise was meant to test a student's reaction to an unexpected apex predator encounter. The creature used was a genstealer, a bioengineered horror from the Forgotten Rim Wars. It was a six-legged beast of chitin and fury, capable of moving in blinding bursts of speed and spitting a corrosive neurotoxin. The safety protocols were, of course, engaged. The creature's claws were capped, its venom sacs were neutered to deliver a mild paralytic, and the student was equipped with a high-energy shield and a training stun rifle. The goal was not to kill the beast, but to survive and disable it within a set time. It was a test of courage and tactical thinking. Vorlag, however, made a few unauthorized adjustments. He designated Kalen for the test, and in the moments before the simulation began, he had a technician discreetly downgrade the power output to the human's shield by 70% and reduce the charge on his rifle to a single low-power shot. The paralytic agent in the genstealer's venom he left at full lethal toxicity. It wasn't murder, he told himself. It was a lesson. The universe did not play fair. The human would be paralyzed, rescued by the safety teams, and his utter failure would be a lesson for all. He would be quietly expelled for his own safety, and the Academy would be cleansed of his weakness. The entire student body gathered in the observation dome, the mood a mix of morbid curiosity and cruel anticipation. Headmaster Ayler watched from his private box, a sense of unease settling in his primary stomach. He trusted Vorlag's experience, but the veteran's open contempt for the human was unsettling. The simulation began. The arena floor, a synthesized jungle environment, materialized. Kalen stood in the center, rifle held loosely, his expression unreadable as ever. On the far side, a blast door hissed open, and the genstealer exploded into the arena. It was a nightmare of clicking mandibles and razor-sharp limbs. It saw Kalen and let out a chittering shriek that echoed off the dome. The other students leaned forward. This was the moment. The creature blurred, moving with a speed that defied its bulk. Kalen raised his rifle and, just as Vorlag predicted, fired his single, pathetic shot. The energy bolt struck the Genstealer's carapace and dissipated with a harmless sizzle, barely even annoying it. The beast didn't even slow down. A collective sneer went through the observation dome. The human was defenseless. He raised his arms, activating his shield. The Genstealer slammed into it. Instead of the bright flare of a fully powered shield deflecting the blow, there was a sickening crunch of energy failing and the dull, wet thud of the creature's claw striking flesh. Kalen was thrown backward, a dark gash torn across his chest. His shield emitter sparked and died. Vorlag allowed himself a grim smile. It was over. The safety teams would move in now. But they didn't. The Genstealer, enraged by the token resistance, spat a glob of green liquid. It struck Kalen in the shoulder, the lethal neurotoxin. In seconds, his nervous system should have collapsed. He should have been a twitching wreck on the floor. But something impossible happened. Kalen shuddered, his muscles seizing for a brief moment. A gasp of pain escaped his lips, and then he steadied himself. He got back on one knee, his eyes, which had always seemed placid and dull, now burned with a light no one had ever seen before. It wasn't courage. It wasn't defiance. It was something older, something terrifying. It was the look of a cornered animal that had decided it was no longer the prey. The Genstealer, confused by its victim's failure to die, charged again. And this time, Kalen didn't try to block. He didn't try to run. He did something that broke every rule of civilized combat. He met the charge. He ducked under the swiping claws, his smaller size suddenly an advantage, and slammed the butt of his useless rifle into one of the creature's knee joints. There was a crack of breaking chitin. The beast shrieked, its leg buckling. What followed was not a fight. It was a dissection. Kalen moved with a brutal, desperate efficiency that was utterly alien to the clean, honorable combat styles of the Academy. He used the environment, kicking dirt and foliage into the creature's optical sensors. He abandoned his rifle and fought with his hands, his feet, his teeth. He took another gash along his arm, but used the momentum to roll and drive his elbow into the creature's exposed neck cartilage. The Genstealer, a creature bred for war and intimidation, had no answer for this level of primal ferocity. It was used to panicked soldiers or honorable warriors. It was not prepared for a rabid dog. The final moments were a blur of visceral violence. Kalen, bleeding from half a dozen wounds and visibly fighting the effects of the poison, managed to climb onto the beast's back. He locked his legs around its thorax, ignoring its thrashing, and began to systematically pound his fists into the weak point at the base of its skull. The sound of the impacts, dull and rhythmic, echoed in the now silent observation dome. The sneers had vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. This wasn't weakness. This was savagery. Finally, with a sickening crunch, the Genstealer collapsed, twitching, its armored head bent at an unnatural angle. Kalen rolled off, landing heavily. He lay on the jungle floor, chest heaving, his body a canvas of crimson and green. He had won. He had killed a fully lethal Genstealer with no shield, one useless shot, and a body full of poison. And then his eyes rolled back and he fell into unconsciousness. Vorlag stared, his multiple jaws hanging slack. The lesson he had intended to teach had backfired spectacularly. He had wanted to expose human weakness. Instead, he had unleashed something he didn't understand. In the private box, Headmaster Ayler was already on his comms, his voice tight with an urgency he hadn't felt in decades. "Get a medical team in there now, top priority, and get me Dr. Zora. I want a full bioscan, a genetic workup, everything. I want to know what that thing is. And I want his complete, unredacted medical file from the human empire. Now." Dr. Zora was a Kyraxian, a species of insectoid scientists known for their meticulous attention to detail and their complete lack of emotional bias. To her, a body was a biological machine, and Kalen's was a machine that was breaking all the rules. She stood over the stasis field in the main medbay, her multifaceted eyes scanning the torrent of data flowing across her screens. "His injuries are severe, Headmaster," she chirped, her tone clinical. "Multiple deep tissue lacerations, internal hemorrhaging, compound fracture of the left radius, standard trauma, but the toxicology report, it makes no sense." Ayler stood beside her, his long, elegant form rigid with tension. "Explain." "The genstealer venom is a complex neurotoxin. It's designed to overwhelm the synaptic pathways of most known carbon-based life forms, inducing total systemic paralysis in under 12 seconds, followed by cardiac arrest. The subject was exposed to a full dose. According to this, his body should be inert. He should be dead." "But he is not," Ayler stated, looking at Kalen's still form. "No, he is not," Zora confirmed. "His immune system, I don't have the words for it. It didn't just fight the toxin, it analyzed it. It broke it down, component by component, and synthesized a counteragent in real time. His T-cells are rewriting themselves. They're adapting. I've never seen anything like it. It's not a standard immune response. It's a military counteroffensive on a cellular level." As she spoke, a secure data packet arrived from the human empire. Kalen's full medical archive. Ayler keyed in his authorization, and the file bloomed open on the main holoscreen. It was dense, filled with biological terminology that made standard medical records look like a child's primer. Zora's mandibles clicked with excitement as she began to parse the information. "Fascinating," she murmured, zooming in on the section marked Genetic Scar Tissue and Inherited Immunities. "It appears Terrans don't just develop immunities. They pass them down. They're encoded directly into their germline DNA. A history of every plague their species has ever survived is written right here." She cross-referenced the data from Kalen's active immune response with the archive. "Ah, here it is. Marker 7 Gamma 9. Adaptive resistance to cytotoxin class 4 and above. The record states this gene became dominant in the human population after the Black Iron Plague of their late second millennium. An engineered bioweapon, it says. One that wiped out a third of their planetary population. They didn't just develop a cure. The survivors' children were born with the cure already in their blood." Ayler felt a chill run down his spine. They weaponized their own survival. "It gets stranger," Zora said, her voice losing its clinical detachment for the first time. "Look at his skeletal structure. Bone density is 2.5 times the galactic average for a creature of his mass. But it's not uniform. It's layered like sedimentary rock. We're seeing evidence of generations of adaptation to fluctuating gravitational fields. And this stress fracture scarring on a cellular level. It's consistent with sustained, high-G combat maneuvering. But their records state they haven't had a spacefaring military for more than a century." Zora began running deeper diagnostics, comparing the human's genetic markers against the galactic historical database. A list of wars, plagues, and extinction-level events scrolled by on one screen, while Kalen's genetic code scrolled on another. The computer began to flag correlations. First one, then another, then a cascade of them. Zora froze, her antennae twitching violently. "Headmaster, this is not possible." "What is it, Doctor?" "The Great Cathar Unification, 40,000 cycles ago. The Civil War was ended by the deployment of the soul-rot prion. It targeted Cathar neurology specifically. It's a footnote in the history books." She pointed a slender claw at the screen. "Marker 12 Delta 4 in the human's non-coding DNA. It's a defunct remnant gene, but its structure is a perfect countersequence to the soul-rot prion. It's a shield, built to defend against a weapon that hasn't existed for 40 millennia." Ayler stared, his mind refusing to process the information. That's a coincidence, a 1 in a trillion case of convergent evolution. Is it? Zora countered, her voice now a low buzz of dawning horror. Then explain this. She pulled up another file. The silicate scourge that nearly destroyed the Vex homeworld, a nanophage designed to consume silicon. The Vex only survived by converting to a crystalline biology. The war lasted 200 years. Look here. Human genetic marker 28 alpha 1. A protein sequence that aggressively bonds to and neutralizes silicon-based nanites. It's dormant, but it's here. She didn't stop. One by one, she pulled up the darkest chapters of galactic history. The psychic inquisition of the Luminians, a war fought against a hive-mind entity that drove entire systems insane. And in Kalen's brain chemistry, a dormant series of neural inhibitors that could dampen and isolate telepathic signals with brutal efficiency. The Sun-Eater pandemic that targeted star-class fusion reactions, causing thousands of stars to prematurely age and die. And in Kalen's mitochondria, a bizarre energy processing enzyme that could, theoretically, draw sustenance from exotic radiation types, the exact kind given off by a dying star. It was a litany of horrors, a roll call of every great cataclysm and apocalyptic war the galaxy had ever known. And in the DNA of this one, supposedly insignificant human, was a specific, tailored defense against every single one of them. The genetic echoes of 100 forgotten wars were screaming from his cells. Ayler stumbled back, leaning against a console for support. The pieces were slotting together in his mind, forming a picture of such terrifying scope that it threatened to shatter his sanity. The fragmented history of humanity, their talk of endless war, it wasn't a myth, and it wasn't about them fighting each other. They weren't boasting, he whispered. They were confessing. Zora turned to him, her multifaceted eyes wide with a terror that transcended scientific curiosity. "Headmaster," she said, her voice trembling. "The records say no species could survive that many wars. They were right. No single species could, but what if they weren't one species? What if they are a library?" The final piece of the puzzle fell into place not from the genetic code, but from a deeply encrypted sub-file in the human archive. It was labeled Project Chimera Atonement Protocol. Ayler, using the highest level of academic override, forced it open. It wasn't a medical file. It was a history, the real history. It spoke of a time before the consortium, before the current elder races had even reached for the stars. It spoke of a progenitor race, a species of such power and arrogance they had conquered a quarter of the galaxy. They called themselves the Architects. They were masters of genetic engineering, of stellar mechanics, of life and death. And they were human, or what would one day become human. These ancient humans, these architects, had fought a civil war of such unimaginable devastation that it tore their empire, and their very genome apart. The two factions threw everything they had at each other: engineered plagues, reality-warping weapons, nanite swarms that ate planets, psychic bombs that extinguished consciousness. They created armies of bioengineered slave races to fight for them, races that would one day evolve into the Cathar, the Luminians, the Vex. The wars of the elder races were just the echoes, the aftershocks of this great, primordial conflict, fought with weapons their distant descendants no longer understood. In the end, there were no winners, just survivors, broken, scattered remnants of a fallen empire. The victors, a coalition of their own former slave races, rounded up the last of the architects. They saw the unquenchable fire in their creators, the terrifying adaptability, the sheer refusal to die. They couldn't extinguish it, so they tried to contain it. They took the survivors, stripped them of their technology, and used their own genetic science against them. They devolved them, locking away their most potent abilities in dormant junk DNA. They shackled their minds, limited their lifespans, and bound them to a fragile, carbon-based form. Then they cast them down onto a single, deliberately hostile planet, a prison world. A place of endless, grinding hardship designed to keep them forever weak, forever fighting amongst themselves, forever trapped in a cycle of primitive struggle. They named the planet Terra, the old architect word for dirt or soil. A final, ultimate insult. They were no longer masters of the stars, they were creatures of the mud. The Galactic Consortium was formed by these former slave races to ensure the architects never rose again. They scrubbed the history, replacing it with the myth of a benevolent, peaceful ascendancy. They watched Terra from afar, occasionally nudging its development with a plague or a carefully aimed asteroid, just to be sure. Every war humanity fought, every disease they conquered, every challenge they overcame was a test. A test the galaxy was certain they would one day fail. But they never failed. The Black Iron Plague wasn't a random mutation. It was a targeted bioweapon deployed by a consortium Black Ops team. The humans didn't just find a cure, they absorbed it, their DNA seizing the weapon and turning it into a shield. The endless cycle of war wasn't just self-destruction. It was the most brutal training regimen in the history of the universe. Generations of humans were forged in a crucible designed to break them, but it only made them stronger. Every atrocity the galaxy had secretly thrown at them had been turned into another tool, another layer of armor, another line of code in their biological grimoire of survival. Their DNA wasn't a blueprint, it was a kill list. It was a record of every enemy that had tried to bury them, and a testament to their own failure to stay dead. The generation ship that had limped into consortium space hadn't been an accident. The fragmented records weren't a result of data loss. It was all a calculated strategy, a quiet re-entry onto a stage from which they had been violently thrown. They played the part of the weak, pathetic refugee because they knew the galaxy's arrogance was their greatest weapon. They let themselves be underestimated, patronized, and pitied. And the transfer student, Kalen, was not a gesture of goodwill. He was a message. Ayler looked from the historical file back to the medical data. He saw it all now. The quiet endurance, the unreadable expression, the shocking explosion of violence when pushed past a certain point. It wasn't the behavior of a weakling. It was the perfected survival instinct of a species that had been at war with the entire galaxy in secret for 50,000 years. The neurotoxin that should have killed him. His ancestors had survived something 1,000 times worse during the chemical inundation on Terra, a forgotten war from their 18th century. His bones, dense enough to withstand high-G maneuvering. They had been forged over millennia of living on a planet that was actively trying to kill them, and then honed by generations who fought tooth and nail for every scrap of land. The brutal, efficient way he had dispatched the Genstealer. That wasn't a fighting style taught in any academy. That was the desperate, ugly, win-at-all-costs knowledge passed down from 1 billion ancestors who had died in the mud, in the dark, in the fire. It was the art of survival perfected. Zora finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. The name of their ship, the one that arrived 100 cycles ago, it was called the Odyssey. Ayler nodded slowly. A long journey home. No, Headmaster, Zora corrected, her multifaceted eyes fixed on Kalen. In one of their old languages, the word Odyssey does not just mean a journey. It means a story of prolonged wandering, filled with hardship and strife, inflicted by vengeful gods. The silence in the medbay was absolute. Vorlag had been brought in, his stony face pale with a dawning comprehension that was far more terrifying than any battlefield defeat. He looked at the unconscious human, not as a weakling, but as the living embodiment of a history he had never been taught. What have we done? Vorlag rumbled, his bravado gone, replaced by a primal fear. We have made the single greatest mistake in the history of civilized life, Ayler said, his voice flat and devoid of hope. For 50 millennia, we have been the wardens of a prison, believing ourselves to be kings. We mistook our prisoners' silence for submission. We mistook their resilience for luck. We looked at the most dangerous, adaptable, and relentlessly tenacious species this universe has ever produced, and we called them weak. He stepped closer to the stasis field, looking down at Kalen's face. The placid mask was gone in his unconscious state, replaced by a simple human exhaustion. He looked young. He looked tired. Tired from a war his generation had not started, but one they were now prepared to finish. "This transfer student," Ayler said, his voice a pronouncement of doom. His presence here was not a request for inclusion. It was an audit. They sent one, single, average specimen to our most elite institution to see if we were still the same arrogant, foolish children who cast them into the darkness all those millennia ago. He gestured to the bloody aftermath of the simulation still playing on a side screen, to the reams of genetic data that painted a portrait of unthinkable survival. And we have given them their answer. The human empire wasn't a fledgling protectorate. It was a coiled serpent, patiently waiting. They had spent thousands of years turning their prison into a fortress and their curse into their greatest weapon. They had mastered the art of being underestimated. They had let the galaxy believe they were a footnote, all the while their DNA was a ticking time bomb, a library of every sin the consortium had ever committed, and a blueprint for a reckoning that was long, long overdue. Checking the transfer student's medical records hadn't revealed a weakness. It had revealed a truth, a brutal, terrifying, and unstoppable truth. The galaxy thought it was studying a new species. In reality, they had just been handed a declaration of a war that, for humanity, had never truly ended. And this time, they wouldn't be fighting with primitive slug-throwers and atomic fire. They would be fighting with 50,000 years of genetically encoded vengeance, and a quiet, patient resilience that the galaxy had mistaken for peace. The age of the consortium was over. The age of man was about to begin again, born from the ashes of a history the galaxy had tried and failed to bury. The spark that was cast into the mud had not been extinguished. It had smoldered in the darkness, waiting, and was now ready to set the entire galaxy ablaze.